In this interview, an economist claims capitalism only survives because governments deliberately keep people unemployed.
Because economics as a discipline is deeply ahistorical, purposefully to make you think that this is a natural, spontaneous order. This is literally what the models say. So if the culprits are the workers, the solution needs to be increasing interest rates so that you create actually harsher unemployment levels. And unemployment, guess what, is actually important for the system. We would not have capitalism without a good dosage of unemployment. Why? Because if the workers did achieve bargaining power, they wouldn't accept these conditions that allow for profit to keep accumulating.
She argues that capitalism isn't natural at all, and it's something governments actively enforce, and that one of the ways they enforce it is unemployment. And unemployment, guess what, is actually important for the system. And that raises a serious question. Is unemployment really designed into the system, or could it emerge for much more ordinary economic reasons? When you hear that, it feels like someone just pulled the curtain back. Like, what we thought was normal economic life, buying, selling, working, is actually a deliberate political system being enforced on us. And that's a powerful idea. But here's an immediate problem with that. If capitalism is enforced, so is every other economic system. So saying capitalism is enforced might sound like a deep revelation, but it doesn't really tell us much. Big economic claims always sound powerful. But there's one question that cuts through almost all of them. Okay, so how does that actually work? What incentives would it create? What prices would it change? What happens when something goes wrong, and what happens next? Because economics is mostly about one stubborn fact: scarcity. There are always limited houses, there are always limited labour, and limited materials. So when someone proposes a new system, the real question isn't whether it sounds fair. The real question is, where does scarcity go? Because scarcity never disappears. It just shows up somewhere else. Enforcement isn't unique. Let's start with the word enforced. Yes, markets require enforcement. Property rights are enforced, contracts are enforced, fraud laws are enforced. Without those, you don't get peaceful exchange, you just get private violence and chaos. But here's what gets skipped. If you abolish private property, that decision is also enforced. If a committee allocates housing, that allocation is then enforced. If the state sets wages, that's enforced. If you cap prices, that is too. There is no economic system without enforcement. So saying capitalism is enforced doesn't really tell us much. The real difference between economic systems isn't enforcement versus freedom. It's how decisions about scarce resources are made and how quickly mistakes get corrected. And that brings us to the real constraint in any economy: scarcity. Every system has to decide who gets what. Markets solve this problem through prices. When housing becomes scarce, prices rise. That rising price is information. It tells builders that more homes are needed. It tells investors where capital should go, and it tells buyers that housing is scarce. Now, if you replace that system with a committee deciding how many houses should exist and who gets them, that decision still has to be enforced, as I said earlier. But now, the information problem becomes huge, because scarcity hasn't disappeared. The houses are still limited. The only difference is that the signal revealing that scarcity is gone. And when the signal disappears, shortages don't vanish, they just get harder to see. In the interview, Mattei argues that capitalism requires what she calls a good dosage of unemployment. If workers achieved full bargaining power, they just wouldn't accept the conditions that allow profit to accumulate. That's a serious claim, and there's actually a grain of truth in it. When labour markets get extremely tight, when unemployment is very low, workers gain bargaining power. Wages rise, employers compete more aggressively for staff. We've seen this recently in places like the US and Australia after the pandemic. Labour shortages pushed wages up in many sectors. So yes, low unemployment strengthens workers. But that still leaves a deeper question. Does that mean unemployment exists because the system is designed to control workers? Or could unemployment emerge for some more ordinary economic reasons? In most economies, wages are prices. They are the price for labour. And like any price, they interact with productivity. If hiring a worker costs more than the value that worker can produce, firms hire fewer workers. That doesn't require a coordinated plan. It can happen simply because businesses cannot pay wages that exceed what the job produces in value. And this is where scarcity enters the picture. An economy has limited resources, limited capital, and constantly changing technologies. Jobs appear in some industries while disappearing in others. Workers change jobs, move locations, retrain. That constant adjustment means some level of unemployment can occur even without anyone designing it. So the disagreement here isn't about whether unemployment can weaken workers' bargaining power. It clearly can. The real question is whether unemployment is deliberately engineered to control workers, or whether it's largely the result of how prices, productivity, and economic change interact. That's a very different explanation.
Economic models, as I show in the book, are deeply classist in the sense that they depict the problems as being due to workers misbehaving. This is how inflation is understood. Why is there inflation? Oh, because the cost of labor are too high, or because people are consuming too much. This is literally what the models say.
That framing implies inflation is mostly a political story about blaming workers. But before we get to the politics, we need to understand the mechanics. What actually causes inflation in the first place? If prices in the whole economy rise, it's rarely because everyone suddenly became greedier. People were greedy last year too. A simpler starting point is this. Inflation happens when spending power grows faster than the supply of goods and services. Imagine an economy that produces 100 cars. If the amount of money people have to buy those cars suddenly doubles, but there are still only 100 cars, the price of cars will tend to rise. Not because people suddenly became greedier, but because purchasing power expanded faster than production. If you misdiagnose that, your solution becomes moral instead of structural. You target villains, you impose controls, you freeze prices. But when you freeze prices, scarcity doesn't vanish, it shows up as shortages. Producers supply less because the signal to produce more has been suppressed. So, before we treat inflation as a political weapon, we need to explain its mechanics. Otherwise, we're responding to symptoms, not causes. At this point, some people will say, what about corporate greed? But there's a problem with that explanation. Companies have always wanted to charge higher prices. They wanted to last year, they wanted to 10 years ago, and greed isn't new. What changes during inflation is not greed. What changes is what customers are able to pay. If customers suddenly have more spending power because of credit expansion, stimulus spending, or supply shortages, businesses can raise prices without losing customers. But if customers don't have that extra spending power, companies that raise prices simply lose sales. So greed may explain who raises prices first, but it doesn't explain why prices across the whole economy start rising at the same time.
It's not a technical fix. Austerity is not just a tool that economists with their neutral models adopt to save us all. It's the opposite. It's the point that economic models, as I show in the book, are deeply classist in the sense that they depict the problems as being due to workers misbehaving. So this is the whole point, is that you see that liberal democracy presupposes economic coercion. And when people rise up against economic coercion, liberals and fascists are best friends.
In the video, austerity is framed as a deliberate political project. Cut spending, weaken workers, protect capital. But before we jump to motives, we need to look at the constraint governments face. Governments cannot spend indefinitely without financing it somehow. If spending exceeds revenue year after year, the gap has to be closed one way or another. There are only a few options. You can raise taxes, you can borrow more, or you can expand money and add credit, which risks inflation. None of those choices are free. Higher taxes can reduce investment or discourage work at the margin. Borrowing increases the debt burden and shifts costs into the future, and monetary expansion erodes purchasing power through inflation. So, austerity is not automatically ideological. Sometimes it's just arithmetic. But that doesn't mean austerity is always good policy either. Austerity can absolutely be done badly. You can cut productive investment while preserving waste. You can raise the wrong taxes. You can tighten fiscal policy right when the economy is already weak. And when that happens, the results can be damaging. A simple example many people remember is Greece after the global financial crisis. Starting in 2010, the government implemented austerity measures to reduce a large budget deficit. What happened? A huge debt crisis, rapid spending cuts, large tax increases, the economy already collapsing. Result, GDP fell by 25%. Unemployment rose above 27%. Youth unemployment above 50%. Cutting spending aggressively while the economy is already collapsing can deepen the downturn. For many people, that experience defines austerity. But the broader historical record is more mixed. Take Canada in the 1990s. At that time, Canada was turning large deficits and faced growing concerns about public debt. The government responded by restructuring spending and gradually reduced the debt. Economic growth continued, and over the following years, the country moved from persistent deficits into fiscal surplus. So there we've got two episodes, two very different outcomes. The real question isn't simply whether austerity exists. The real question is how it's designed, when it's implemented, and what alternatives were available. Without that analysis, the explanation risks becoming too simple. If austerity is always described as a political weapon, we stop asking the harder questions. What exactly was cut? What incentives changed? What would the alternative policies have done to taxes, debt, or inflation? Those mechanisms matter because once you start looking at them, austerity stops looking like a single ideological project and starts looking like something more familiar in economics, a series of difficult trade-offs under constraint. Without that, austerity equals class warfare is more narrative than analysis.
Participatory budgeting is a reality that has been completely excluded from the way we run our economy because it's dangerous for the status quo, but is something that was invented in Brazil, actually, and we should really look at in the 80s. It's the idea that people can take on responsibilities in ideating how their money should be spent and voting on it in a way that actually is much more inclusive. This is happening in some parts of the world, but this could be, for example, an instrument to get people to realize that they can have much more agency.
The video gestures towards a collective democracy as a better model. More participation, more direct allocation, and participation sounds good, but participation doesn't eliminate scarcity. It changes who makes the decisions. There are only a few ways to allocate scarce resources: prices, queues, rationing, bureaucratic rules, political decisions. If you suppress prices, you don't eliminate competition for resources, you move it. Instead of paying more, you wait longer. Instead of rent, you face a housing list. Instead of price signals, you get administrative allocation. And administrative allocation has its own predictable problems. Benefits are concentrated, costs are diffused, organised groups have more influence than dispersed individuals. This isn't a defence of every market outcome. It's a reminder that replacing price coordination and political coordination introduces new distortions. The question is not whether markets are perfect. The question is whether the alternative handles information and incentives better. To be fair, the video is right about one thing. Institutions matter. Rules matter. Power exists. Economic systems don't fall from the sky. They are built and maintained. But here's where it gets it wrong. It treats capitalism like the source of scarcity. It treats enforcement like the proof of injustice. And it tells a moral story without fully testing the economic mechanism. If you want to critique a system properly, you have to ask the harder questions. How does it process information? How quickly does it correct mistakes? What incentives does it create? And compared to what? Scarcity doesn't disappear when you change the slogan, it just moves. Every system enforces something. Both have costs. The adult conversation is about which costs are smaller and which distortions we're willing to live with. Every system creates trade-offs. The real debate isn't capitalism versus democracy, it's decentralized price coordination versus political allocation. Both have costs. The adult conversation is about which costs are smaller and which distortions we're willing to live with. Economics isn't about good ideas versus bad ideas, it's about trade-offs. If you want more clear thinking about the forces shaping our world, consider subscribing, and remember, always follow the incentives.